The passenger leaned forward and shouted orders to move and not stop. A close, dark shot revealed a face as a pale blue mark began flickering. The passenger said that the flicker meant the target would reduce soon. Someone off-panel warned plainly that the driver would kill someone if unchecked. The passenger snapped back and ordered the voice to stop pretending to know. The driver clenched an object, breathed, and braced for the immediate aftermath. A crowd at the crosswalk watched in stunned silence as officers and sirens drew near. The passenger ordered the driver to listen and then began a loud countdown from 3. The driver kept both hands on the wheel and tightened his grip on a hidden object. As the numbers fell, a close dark shot showed the driver's strained face and a pale blue flicker across skin. On 1, the driver forced the wheel and the vehicle lunged forward, headlights cutting wet air. Tires shrieked against pavement, and a shocked figure at the windshield gasped. The passenger barked with urgency, while someone off-panel warned that the driver would kill if unchecked. Officers and sirens approached in the distance, but the car already gathered speed. It crossed the crosswalk, left a sweeping skid, and sped away into the lined city avenue, leaving onlookers stunned and the scene raw with motion. The driver had forced the wheel, and the car collided with a figure at the windshield. The impact jolted the cabin and sent a shocked cry outward. A dark attacker then lunged through the open space, blade flashing against interior light. The metal bit into flesh and blood sprayed across hands and the steering wheel. The driver staggered but kept pressure on the pedals with a bloody grip. The passenger gasped and reached toward the wound, fingers slick with red. The attacker pressed the blade deeper and then struck again, driving chaos through the small space. Tires screamed as the vehicle gathered speed and left a smeared scene behind. Distant sirens drew closer, but could not stop the car as it fled down the avenue. The car had left deep, curved skid marks across the avenue as it tore onward. Headlights flashed and taillights traced a ragged path over wet pavement. Inside the cabin, 2 injured occupants struggled against shock and spreading blood. A wounded hand kept pressure on the wheel while the other person gasped and reached toward the wound. An unknown attacker had forced open space and driven a blade into flesh repeatedly. The vehicle accelerated despite the blood, sirens rising in the distance, yet arriving too late. A timestamp appeared noting 2020, November 15, 21:06. One bloodied occupant choked out words, accusing someone of sending the attack. The scene closed on a car fleeing into night with bloodied hands on the wheel. The investigator and others watched the recorded sequence and accepted a grim inevitability about what would happen. A hand smeared with blood appeared as a blade repeatedly cut into flesh. The wounded person convulsed and screamed, while the assailant struck without pause. The driver kept control of the wheel despite collapsing and blood spreading across the cabin. The vehicle pulled away into night and left a thin trail of red behind it. Droplets fell from the car and hit the pavement in irregular arcs. A blue symbol hovered above the road as the scene cut to distance. A timestamp recorded November 15, 2020 at 21:06 on the footage. A bloodied occupant choked out words, accusing an unseen sender of arranging the assault. He had replayed the recorded assault until the images would not leave him. The investigator left the building and moved through a quiet lobby under low light. He accepted the ache in his chest and kept walking past a notice board and a mirrored wall. A colleague called a brief thanks as boxes shifted in her arms. He descended the metal stairwell with measured steps. At the landing, he paused and thought about how far he had come. A woman carrying packages squeezed past and muttered an apology as they passed. A sudden blinding flare erupted between them. Shards of light and debris struck the passerby. She cried out and clutched her arm as the scene froze in stunned silence. The investigator replayed the assault recording until its images lodged in his mind. He left into a dim lobby and accepted the ache in his chest. He passed a notice board and a mirrored wall and heard a colleague thank him. He descended the metal stairwell with measured steps and paused at the landing. A woman carrying packages squeezed past and apologized. A sudden flare of light erupted between them. A box came loose above and plunged toward the stairwell. The investigator watched it fall and heard the sharp crack of impact. The box struck the woman, knocking her backward onto a bench, and she cried out. Shards of light and debris scattered, freezing the stairwell in stunned silence. He stepped forward to help as bright flecks clustered at the edge of his vision. The investigator watched a cardboard box loosen and tumble from the overhead shelf. It angled in midair, struck the stair rail, and split open on impact. The box hit Nye on the shoulder and chest. She cried out and collapsed backward onto the bench. Cardboard shards and packing tape scattered across the steps and landing. A sudden hush fell over the stairwell as dust motes spun in the light. The investigator descended with quick, controlled steps despite the swirl at his vision. He crouched beside Nye and reached to steady her while scanning for obvious wounds. She lay breathing but shocked, hand pressed to her chest among the scattered packages. He called her name and asked if she could move. No one else emerged from the lobby. The echo of the fall lingered as he prepared to lift her carefully. The investigator reached Nye as she roused, clutching her chest and gasping. She tried to stand and thanked him, voice cracked and hands trembling. Others converged on the landing, a colleague called, and people clustered above. A tall, dark figure on the stairs stayed still and said nothing. The investigator scanned the scene, noting shock, scattered cardboard, and displaced tape. Someone asked who had caused the fall, but no clear witness emerged. Nye's gaze shifted toward the man's hand, then down to the stair. The investigator noticed a printed number on a small tag beside the shoe. He also saw scuffed white sneakers and a brief close-up of pale hair. The pairing of the number and the shoes felt significant and heightened suspicion. The investigator reached Nye as she roused and clutched her chest, gasping for air. She tried to stand and thanked him with trembling hands and a cracked voice. People gathered on the landing, and a colleague called from above. A tall, dark figure remained motionless on the stairs and said nothing. The investigator scanned the scene and noted scattered cardboard and displaced tape. Nye's gaze shifted from the man's hand down to the stair and a small tag. He focused on a printed number beside a scuffed white sneaker in close-up. The pairing of the number and the shoes raised suspicion without a clear witness. Flash panels showed a woman alone on a train, documents and a phone, and a whispered question. A final shadowed frame lingered over a pale face and the case title. The investigator pressed a small blue inhaler to Nye's lips and held it there. She coughed once, then fought through each ragged inhalation while eyes watched. A hand steadied her forehead as someone urged her to open her eyes. A colleague called questions from the classroom doorway and moved closer to help. Nye's pupils dilated, and the investigator noticed a sudden focus on her sneaker. He compared the shoe and printed number with his earlier notes, and unease grew. Flashes of memory showed a woman alone on a train and a whispering question. Nye suddenly screamed, and a door marked staff only slammed open in reply. The group froze as new danger tightened the case's focus and urgency rose. The investigator steadied himself and prepared to follow the trail the evidence suggested. Nye blinked and muttered that her eyes stung more than usual that morning. The colleague hovered at the classroom doorway and asked if she had slept enough. Nye shrugged and said she did not know, unable to explain the sudden irritation. Someone reassured them that Heng would be fine and tried to dismiss the worry. A television screen then lit, and an older man in a suit addressed the room with a careful tone. Students leaned forward and asked the professor for his opinion on the footage. The professor summarized the evidence and warned that ignoring details left only dust behind. The class debated the case's clever elements while they replayed the clip. Nai remained quiet and attempted to reconcile her blurred vision with what she watched. The investigators' earlier notes and the sneaker comparison waited in the background as urgency tightened around the case. Nai blinked and rubbed at her stinging eyes as the class replayed the footage. The colleague lingered by the doorway and asked if she had slept enough. The students leaned closer while the professor outlined evidence from the screen. They argued about angles and shoe marks as the clip played repeatedly. A young man stood and warned he would head back first for the night. The classroom emptied, and Nai slipped out without answering anyone's small talk. She paused at a stairwell landing and watched the empty corridor below. Night gathered outside, and two students walked the campus discussing her outward calm. One said she seemed fine on the surface despite whatever had happened to her. Footsteps and distant sounds made them hunch and listen into the dark corridor. Nai's expression tightened, and she pressed a hand to her mouth to steady herself. Nai exhaled and forced herself to breathe slowly as the lamp light trembled. She stepped into the cool night and drew a long, steadying breath. Traffic hummed on the far street while neon signs flickered above closed shops. She pressed a hand to her mouth and tried to calm the nausea. She whispered that it was okay and started walking toward the bus stop. A sudden memory tightened her face, and she stopped to steady herself. Two students waited at a nearby shelter and traded casual warnings about leaving late. They told each other to be careful and then walked off together. Nai watched them go, blinked back tears, and set her jaw with effort. She scanned the empty sidewalk, kept her shoulders level, and repeated she was fine. Then she moved on toward the station with a thin, guarded composure. Nai stepped into the night and kept her breathing even as neon hummed. She told herself she would absorb the cost and endure. Inside the break room, the staff ate and traded tired jokes about the boss while she stayed quiet. Her stomach tightened, and she steadied herself with a small self-pat. A smiley lamp glowed above, and she fixed her gaze there to force a lighter expression. At the vending machine, she acted casual and placed an order. Colleagues spoke of shifts and survival. She listened and held the routine. She resolved that repeated small acts might help her find herself again. Then a shadowed man paused and looked toward her, and the room shifted slightly colder. Nai moved through the break room and kept her breathing steady under humming lights. She kept her face casual and tapped her phone without meeting anyone's eyes. A colleague called Jaehyun, and heads turned toward the newcomer at the table. Nai froze when someone asked who the woman was, and the air tightened. A shadowed man stared at her, and the room immediately felt colder. She stepped outside alone to steady herself against the night and the noise. Her pulse slowed, but a single word echoed in the next corridor. Wait. She stopped at a poster that bluntly declared murderer and felt the moment pull taut. Voices and commands cut through her head and told her to stop. She clung to routine and held the moment between breath and decision. Nai had moved from the break room into a carriage bright with phone lights. People scrolled and filmed while a single printed sign read murderer in blunt type. Someone called a name and heads turned, and she felt air compress around her chest. A shadowed man stared across the aisle, and a low laugh threaded the carriage. Voices traded incredulous lines about survivors and reporters, and the mood leaned toward accusation. Nai's breath became shallow, and her hands clenched at her bag strap. She let routine steady her long enough to register the man's grin, then felt an old knot of fear turn into focused resolve. The others returned to chatter, but her gaze stayed fixed on the watcher, whose smile matched the poster's claim. Unnai moved from the break room into a carriage lit by phone screens. People filmed while a single printed sign read "Murderer" in blunt type. Someone called a name and heads turned, air tightened around her chest. A shadowed man stared across the aisle, and a low laugh threaded the carriage. Voices traded incredulous accusations, and the mood lined toward judgment. Unnai's breath grew shallow, and her hands clenched at her bag strap. She let routine steady her long enough to note the man's grin, then an old knot of fear became resolute focus. The passengers spilled from the train into the night, and phones tracked the crowd. On the sidewalk, a woman screamed and cupped her face against a white glare. Her vision blurred and tears fell as she staggered backward. People scattered and a single figure stood under a street lamp, still and watching as distant sirens rose. Rain fell in hard sheets across the empty streets as a hooded figure climbed to a high rooftop and stood over the sleeping blocks. He scanned the lit alleys and watched distant silhouettes move below. The phrase "as for" the number appeared in his mind as he produced a small folded object and examined it under the rain. Drops ran down his face, and his gaze tightened until his eyes narrowed. A sharp scream cut through the night, and bright flashes of light flared from the street. The noise yanked his attention back to the scene below. He held the paper steady, then stepped back into shadow as sirens rose faintly in the distance. Rain and distant sirens had already set the scene when the hooded figure stepped closer and spoke Jaehyun's name. He watched her face in the dim light and asked who she truly was. His voice cut through the night and left a hard silence in its wake. Jaehyun shrank inward, clutching herself as tears ran down her cheeks. She offered no answer, and only small sounds escaped her lips. The attacker held his gaze and waited, his expression unreadable beneath the hood. The exchange ended without resolution, and the rooftop shadows swallowed both figures as tension lingered in the air. Lights and camera shutters cut through the dark as reporters crowded the site and demanded answers. Photographers pressed forward while officials and lenses moved between flashes. The sequence then shifted to a small living room where two women sat close on a sofa. One held the other and both watched a television feed that displayed Jaehyun's case with grainy footage and stills. A child spoke and the room paused. The broadcast offered images and documents without closure. A telephone call rang and a woman answered, then snapped into a sharp demand down the line. Printed photos and papers lay spread beneath the screen. The media glare left the family exposed and the investigation unresolved beneath relentless public attention. The media glare had left the family exposed and the investigation unresolved under public pressure. After the broadcast, cameras and shutters receded, but the attention lingered in private spaces. Jaehyun sat in a dim room and stared at a small screen without reacting. She answered a call and spoke once before retreating into a blank expression. A photograph of a bloodied doll and scattered documents lay beneath the screen. For a while she moved and slept, as if half awake with diminished affect. Later, a solitary desk lit the classroom where she stood before an empty chair. A caption declared her age 14, and voices outside the office demanded her removal. Peers whispered accusations in the hallway and pushed school authorities toward punishment. She remained at the doorway watching without protest while the world judged her. The public glare had burned through any private shield, and the case remained unresolved under pressure. Jaehyun pulled into a dim room and stared at a small screen without reaction. She answered a single call and spoke once before her face went blank. A photograph of a bloodied doll and scattered papers sat beside her device. She moved and slept as if half awake and appeared to lack feeling. In a silent classroom, a lone desk held her book and a caption read 14 years old. Voices gathered outside the office and demanded she be removed. Peers whispered and urged officials toward punishment. She lingered at the doorway and watched the world decide her fate without resistance. The public glare had eroded Jaehyun's privacy, and the case remained unresolved under pressure. She sat in a dim room with a small screen and scattered papers beside her. Two men burst into the doorway, and one called her name sharply. She flinched and recoiled when a hand struck her face without warning. A pamphlet and a report were offered next, their pages open to a profile. A man spoke about her loss and a prior suicide attempt in clipped tones. Jaehyun remained withdrawn and listless at a lone classroom desk while officials watched. An official pushed a red file across a table and waited for a reaction. In a quiet close-up, she disclosed a private memory about her father leaving. Public scrutiny had stripped Jaehyun of privacy while the case lingered unresolved. She sat alone in a dim room, a small screen and scattered papers at her side. Two men forced the doorway, and one called her name with sharp urgency. She flinched and a hand struck her face without warning. An official set a pamphlet and a report in front of her, the pages turned to a profile. A man spoke clinically about her loss and a prior suicide attempt while observers watched. An officer slid a red file across the table and waited for any response. In a quiet close-up, Jaehyun disclosed a private memory of her father leaving, and she drew inward again beneath the loaded silence. Public attention had left Jaehyun exposed, while the investigation remained unresolved and slow. She sat alone in a dim room with scattered papers and a small screen. Her thoughts turned inward. She wondered if books could silence the recurring nightmares. A quick image of a clenched hand crossed her mind as a fresh ache. Memory shifted into a face identified by a caption as Ko Hyun-cheol, masked and distant. The panel labeled that moment, that time, and then cut to harsh self-reproach. Text called her suffering eternal and placed a curse on her private past. The scene widened to a bright campus where anonymous figures moved through day routines. She remained at the edge of those frames, observed but isolated from the crowd. Silence settled, the public case and her private fear felt indistinguishable now. Jaehyun had a narrowed gaze in the first panel as light caught her eye. She heard distant cries over a campus field and watched shadowed figures move through rain and trees. The noise startled her and she flinched, then sat alone on a bench in the sunlit quad. She pressed her temples and muttered that she did not understand what was happening. Her inner narration told her to squint and force herself to focus on shapes. She forced her eyes until faint text and symbols edged into view. Glowing numerals emerged in bright panels and hovered close to her face. She tried to read the digits and find meaning in their order. The final view left the numbers unresolved but urgent in her mind. Jaehyun had seen numerals hover close to her face earlier that day. She later sat alone on a stone bench in the campus quad. A sudden cry escaped her before she could gather coherent thought. She pressed both temples and muttered that she did not understand. A colleague noticed and walked over, keeping his steps slow and careful. He sat beside her and quietly asked what had happened. Jaehyun tried to say nothing, but her voice betrayed tension. The colleague produced a small yellow tube from his bag without fanfare. She stared at it and raised a brow in puzzled silence. He named it new hand cream and offered it as a trivial comfort. Jaehyun accepted the small object and tried to breathe more steadily. They shared short, ordinary words while the campus continued its slow rhythm. The colleague kept a gentle smile and stayed until she steadied. Jaehyun remembered the numerals that had hovered near her face earlier that day. She sat on the stone bench and flinched as a cry escaped her. The colleague noticed and crossed the quad with slow, careful steps. He sat beside her and produced a small yellow tube from his bag. He named it New Hand Cream and offered it as a trivial comfort. Jaehyun stared at the tube, raised a brow, and accepted it with shaking fingers. She forced a laugh that broke into a tremor and wetness at her eyes. The colleague kept a gentle smile and watched without pressing her for answers. She muttered that it was nothing and tried to steady her breath. After a long pause, they remained together while students passed by and campus life continued. Jaehyun had remembered the numerals that had hovered near her face earlier that day. She sat on the stone bench and flinched as a cry escaped her. The colleague crossed the quad with careful, steady steps and sat beside her. He produced a small yellow tube from his bag and offered it as a trivial comfort. Jaehyun stared at the tube, accepted it with shaking fingers, and forced a laugh that broke into a tremor. The colleague kept a gentle smile and did not press for answers. She muttered that it was nothing and admitted she could not do anything. The scene later shifted to a school corridor beneath a principal sign. Small groups of students clustered and whispered about kicking her out and about money. Bills and papers drifted across a panel as rumor hardened into public pressure and isolation. Jaehyun remembered the numerals that had hovered near her face earlier that day. She sat on the stone bench and flinched as a cry escaped her. The colleague crossed the quad with steady steps and sat beside her. He produced a small yellow tube from his bag and offered it without questions. Jaehyun took it with shaking fingers and forced a laugh that broke into a tremor. She muttered that it was nothing and admitted she could not do anything. Later, the corridor beneath the principal's sign filled with clustered students and whispering voices. Bills and papers drifted past as rumor hardened into public pressure and isolation. Back on the bench, they spoke about proving their futures and about staying well. He said he wanted to be happy with a healthy mind and not become like that. She laughed to ease the worry and watched a family walk by. After a pause, he rose and suggested they should go to class together. Jaehyun followed, and they left across the quad under a pale sky. Jaehyun had clung to the day's strange numerals and flinched on the stone bench earlier. The colleague sat beside her and handed over a small yellow tube without pressing her. She took it with trembling fingers and laughed to hide the tremor. He rose and offered his hand, then suggested coffee. She accepted, and they left across the campus toward the city. At a glass entrance, they paused beside a glowing screen that read 5 while streetlights brightened. They moved through crowded storefronts and kept easy conversation to steady her. Later, she bit an ice cream cone and smiled with brief relief. In a close view, her pupils tightened and light caught her eyes. A stark digital readout flashed 3:02 at the bottom of the frame. Jaehyun had carried the day's odd numerals with her since morning. The colleague had handed a yellow tube and guided her off campus toward the city. They moved past a glass entrance and a glowing display that read 5 earlier. Later, Jaehyun bit an ice cream cone and managed a brief smile. A nearby screen then flashed a digital readout showing 3:01 above them. The colleague noticed and asked what was wrong with quiet concern. She answered that it was nothing and tried to steady her voice. He studied her face, and the space tightened between thought and action. Panels showed inner captions and hollow ovals framing her alarms. They stepped back into a crowded street where passers-by closed around them. Lights and shop signs moved past while the numbers kept intruding on her attention. Jaehyun walked on beside the colleague, though the unease remained unresolved. Jaehyun carried the day's odd numerals with her into the city that morning. The colleague handed her a yellow tube and guided her off campus. They passed a glass entrance and a display that had flashed 5 earlier. Later, she bit an ice cream cone and managed a brief smile for him. A nearby screen then flashed a bright 301 above them and drew her gaze. He asked what was wrong with quiet concern and studied her face closely. She said it was nothing and tried to steady her voice and hands. Panels showed inner captions and hollow ovals that framed her alarms. They stepped into a crowded street where passersby closed around them and moved past. Lights and shop signs shifted while the numbers kept intruding on her attention. She walked beside the colleague, though unease tightened the space between thought and action. Nothing was resolved, and her alarms continued as they walked on. Jaehyun and the colleague moved through a crowded street while passersby flowed past them. Two figures ahead paused, then turned and watched, prompting a quiet exchange about nearly getting caught. One of the pair scolded the other to be careful and to stop acting recklessly. They hushed each other and slipped back into the crowd. The colleague kept Jaehyun close as her tension rose with each step. Voices stayed low as the group passed shops and signs. A circular lens then filled a dark panel. A voice ordered them to take it properly because they were moving again. The lens registered as a deliberate presence from a distance, and Jaehyun felt observed, which tightened her movements. The investigator scrutinized a stark headline about Ko Hyuncheol's daughter and opened the video. The short clip showed a smiling woman flanked by three companions in public. An on-screen caption claimed she was living happily, but the footage ended abruptly. The sender's note said she had seemed lively, yet the file recorded her death 2 days later. The clip bore a November 17 timestamp and linked to a Memorial Day recording. The cheerful image directly conflicted with the case's grim timeline and raised new questions. The investigator logged the clip as evidence and flagged the timing discrepancy for analysis. He considered how public appearances could mask private danger within the case. He prepared the footage and notes for follow-up and cross-referenced related entries. The investigator opened the packet and watched the new clip sequence. A solitary speaker addressed the camera with a mocking tone, dismissed sympathy, and declared God is dead. The feed showed the clip uploaded to a public channel with a visible thumbnail and a thread of debating comments, one message highlighted as a stark blacked comment. The panels then shifted to a wide city rooftop and the surrounding blocks, establishing locale. A lone man descended stairs, crossed a street, and walked away with measured steps. The investigator noted the contrast between the staged monologue and the anonymous street movement. He logged the video, flagged the public comments for source tracing, and earmarked the walker's route for location confirmation and cross-reference. The investigator followed the clip sequence as the camera cut from a staged monologue to street movement. A lone man descended stairs, then crossed the block with measured steps while nearby voices rose. A group confronted the walker and shouting spread as officers moved in and bystanders raised phones. The feed showed public comments and a highlighted thread that the investigator marked for tracing. The sequence shifted again to a close domestic moment. A finger pressed a buzzer and a door opened. A woman at the doorway recognized the visitor and exchanged a brief greeting. The camera then lingered on a phone display with the uploaded clip visible, linking the public footage back to the private threshold the scene had just crossed. The investigator had traced the uploaded clip to a private doorway feed and watched the exchange closely. A hooded woman crouched on the floor while a man stood in the doorway and called to her. He asked if she had seen her face clearly and whether she understood the danger. She answered in small guarded phrases and clutched the cloak around her shoulders. He suggested that if she had been framed, coming inside would be safer and less public. He held up the phone and inspected the uploaded image, then said it looked like the people involved. She became quieter and avoided naming anyone. He urged her to stay calm and explain nothing yet. The investigator logged the interaction and marked the feed for follow-up tracing. The investigator accessed the private doorway feed and watched the exchange unfold in close view. A man asked pointed questions about a circulated image and whether she recognized anyone there. The woman answered in guarded phrases and pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. She admitted a fear that she would never grow into a normal life and that she might take the wrong path. A close shot of her eye showed the panic of imagined public scorn if she ever looked healthy. They shifted to a small desk and argued over motives and plans. She revealed she had been quietly saving for an entrance exam. The man reacted with a blank look that offered no comfort. They lingered by the doorway uneasy and unresolved. The investigator logged the footage and flagged the feed for follow-up tracing. The investigator accessed the private doorway feed and watched the exchange in close view. A man at the door asked pointed questions about a circulated image. The woman answered in guarded phrases and pulled her cloak tighter. She admitted fear of never fitting a normal life and of making wrong choices. A close shot captured panic in her eye at imagined public scorn. They moved to a small desk and argued over motives and quiet plans. She revealed she had been quietly saving for an entrance exam. The man reacted with a blank look that offered no comfort. Timestamps flashed 3:31 as silence stretched and the woman whispered no. She sagged to the floor near the doorway and pleaded, "Don't go back." The investigator logged the footage and flagged the feed for follow-up tracing. Later, the camera captured the city at dusk, then a shadow moved inside another room. The investigator continued monitoring the private feed after flagging the earlier doorway exchange. The camera then cut to a cramped room where a man searched a low cabinet and refrigerator quietly. He inspected containers and muttered to himself while the city glowed beyond the window. He froze when a new sound came from the hallway and watched the corridor pass without movement. He stood and moved toward the door with measured steps. At the door, he hesitated, then reached for the knob and turned it. The latch clicked and the door eased open to reveal a silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. He stepped back and asked aloud in shock. The investigator marked the moment and cued the clip for deeper tracing and doorframe analysis. The investigator continued reviewing the feed and watched the scene through the doorway camera. A man called into the room and a cluster of residents gathered immediately at the entrance. They asked if he was related to the occupant and pressed him for answers while he insisted otherwise. Voices called the occupant's name and demanded to know if she was there. The camera revealed Jaehyun collapsed or slumped on the floor as people peered in. A woman ordered the man to leave and threatened to call the police. The intruder froze beneath the hallway light while onlookers circled the doorway. A gloved hand moved into the frame, and the investigator flagged that motion for closer tracing and timing analysis. The investigator continued watching the doorway camera feed that night. The camera captured a man pressing close and shouting into another's face. A bright beam from a phone or flashlight cut across their features while someone hissed and barked. A gloved hand re-entered the frame, and the investigator logged its timing precisely. The intruder halted as residents crowded the entrance and demanded answers. The investigator then stepped into the hall and observed the scene directly. Voices mentioned Ms. S. and recalled how she had been bullied and called pretty by others. Two young taunters appeared smiling cruelly in a memory flash. The investigator felt that the flagged glove movement and the recalled taunts might connect to motive, so he tightened his focus and recorded every detail for later analysis. The investigator had kept the camera feed running and noted earlier glove movements and taunts. He stepped into the stair hall to observe and record the scene directly. A tall intruder reappeared in the frame and closed distance to a young man. The intruder produced a bright blade and then struck with sudden force. The knife cut through clothing and struck flesh, causing the victim to collapse. Two residents screamed loudly and then scrambled backward toward the stairwell railing in alarm. The investigator shouted and lunged forward to disrupt the assailant's motion and protect others. The assailant twisted violently and struck again before anyone could fully intervene. Bystanders called for help, and some fell beside the injured man in pain. The investigator recorded the exact timing and actions as the stair hall descended into chaos. The investigator had kept the camera feed running and then stepped into the stair hall. He observed a pale hand slip a knife from a narrow pocket and approach. A startled student tried to block the path and cried out in shock. The attacker lunged, blade bright, and cut through cloth deep into flesh. The wounded man collapsed as panicked neighbors screamed quickly and stumbled back. The investigator shouted, lunged forward, and tried to shield others from harm. The assailant twisted and struck again before any help could reach them. The camera recorded exact timings as the stairwell descended into chaotic noise. Later, the investigator noticed digital numbers flicker around the injured man like markers. Each number aligned to a pulse a minute or a second falling away. He realized time itself was mapped on victims and life bled downward. The investigator had earlier kept a camera feed running and recorded events leading to this moment. The page opened on two hooded figures trading words and plans. They displayed a chat screenshot. The messages claimed they needed someone to act as Yan Hee-seol's daughter. The thread framed vengeance and placement of a pawn. A woman stood nearby and listened, tense and quiet. A man moved close behind her with a knife already in hand. He murmured agreement and steadied himself in the dim light. Then the attacker lunged and plunged the blade into her back without warning. She gasped and staggered, clutching at the wound and her coat. The assailant held a dark silhouette against the rain while the victim began to fall. The investigator had kept a camera feed running and recorded the final moments. The sequence opened on a knife, suspended in stark cold light above the frame. A young woman turned toward the sound and stared with wide, surprised eyes. Blood already speckled her coat, and a wet line showed across her back. A nearby man looked dazed and bore fresh cuts on his cheek. A gloved hand gripped the blade and held it steady in front. A shadowed figure stepped forward and called Jae-hyun's name while asking last words.